Good morning, or wherever it may be. I'm Dan Mahaffey. I'm the Senior Vice President and Director of Policy at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. I want to thank you for joining us today. I have a conversation here today with Dr. Samuel Ramani. He's the author of a book, Russia in Africa, Resurgent Great Power or Bellicose Pretender. Dr. Ramani is a tutor of politics and international relations at the University of Oxford, as well as being an associate fellow at RUSI. He has also briefed the NATO Intelligence Fusion Center, the U.S. Department of State, the French MOD, quite a few others, as well as appearing on quite a few of the more renowned media networks around the world, the BBC, CNN, France 24, etc. So thank you for joining us today. I want to turn it over to Dr. Ramani, and then also my colleague Joshua Huminski will be moderating our conversation. But looking forward to this interesting topic, and thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Dan, for the introduction. It's really great to be here.
Well, thank you so much again for joining. I'll echo Dan's comments, Dr. Ramani. I very much enjoyed your book, Russia and Africa, which you reviewed for the Diplomatic Courier, and we will put the chat link in the chat, for that review. And if I'm not mistaken, it's actually one of two or possibly three books you have coming out this year.
Yeah, two books coming out this year. So one in February, which was Russia and Africa, and also one in April, which was Putin's war in Ukraine. And now I'm working on one about American policy in Africa, but that will probably be published in 2024.
Well, that's going to be a fantastic read as well. But we're here to talk about Russia and Africa today, which I really am very excited about. Your book is probably the best single volume out there on Russia, post-Soviet Union in Africa. What made you decide to write this book, and what was the inspiration behind it?
So basically, it was something that I was following quite tangentially as a product of Russia's global power projection, also what Russia's doing in the Middle East and other theaters. And then the Sochi summit rolled around, and I got contacted by a professor over at Tufts University who was working on a project with the U.S. Defense Department about Russia's arms sales in Africa and Russia's security engagement on the continent. And that was really interesting. Over the course of 8 or 9 months, I wrote briefings, I researched it, I explored it, and I just found that it was a fascinating topic with a lot of dimensions that simply were ignored in the media and also in academic literature. There's no study in a single book volume on Russia and Africa, really since the Soviets abandoned Mengistu in Ethiopia or the end of the Angolan Civil War. So I figured that, after all that research and my interest in the subject, I would be quite uniquely suited to filling that gap.
Well, it's excellent. I think you filled that gap very well. I want to dive into the subtitle of the book, which is The Resurgent Great Power or Bellicose Pretender. Having read the book, it's very, very balanced approach to kind of answering both of these. And where did you land on that question specifically? What did you find?
Well, basically, I kind of struck a bit of a middle ground over there. And obviously, the bulk of the book's content, except for the last chapter, was written before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And then I had to add a chapter and a conclusion that dealt with the post-February 2022 scenarios, and it had to make me reassess what I put up at the front. In general, my conclusion is that Russia is a virtual great power in Africa. And what I mean by that is that it has all the trappings and all the pageantry and all the symbolism of great power status. For example, Vladimir Putin can host 43 leaders at the Sochi summit in 2019, and he may well be able to get a decent turnout at the July 2023 summit in St. Petersburg, particularly as he offers free grain and fertilizer and seems to be trying to keep as many African countries as neutral as possible. Russia also has a Soviet-era legacy of being a sponsor of decolonization movements and opposing apartheid that it can channel to the present day in order to win intra-elite bonding as well as bolster its image. And it presents itself as an inheritor of the Soviet Union's superpower status too. In addition, the Russians have a foothold, either geopolitically or informally militarily, on almost every region of the continent. In North Africa, they've got partnerships with Egypt and Algeria that are strong and robust and decades long, as well as a Wagner Group military presence in Libya. Turning to West Africa, they've got a Wagner Group presence in Mali, a nascent partnership with Burkina Faso, as well as alignments with countries like Guinea. Moving to the east, they've got a Wagner Group presence in Sudan. Ethiopia, they bonded with them over the Tigrayan War and their support for non-interference. Moving to Central Africa, they've got CAR as a base, and they're building relations with other countries, especially the Republic of Congo. And also in South Africa, they have the legacy of opposing apartheid and a cordial relationship with the ANC, as well as capitalizing on Zimbabwe's basically ostracization from the West and them being the primary partner there and their arms deals with Angola. But the actual substance of these partnerships is not very strong and falls well below what the Soviet Union had or whatever they claim to have. They promised $11 billion in investments at the Sochi summit, and virtually none of them transpire. Their trade volume is $20 billion in sub-Saharan Africa. That's less than Turkey and 1/3 that of India. And their military track record is also almost a precursor or like a premonition of what we've seen happen in Ukraine. But as soon as they were challenged by Turkey and Libya, they failed. In Mali, they haven't achieved anything. They were forced to withdraw humiliatingly from Mozambique. And CAR, they're better at capturing minds and supporting the autocrat Touadera in power than they are at really stabilizing or securing the country, at least outside the capital. So that's why I argue that much of the great power status is smoke and mirrors and it's illusions. So it looks like a great power, but it's a virtual one.
That's a very great description of it, and it's helpful to characterize the actual practicalities and what's really happening versus what the West thinks is happening. Before we really dive down into that aspect, I was hoping we could talk a little bit about the interests across the continent and what is Russia looking to actually accomplish on the continent. Is it all about undermining the West and the Western narrative? Is it about the pursuit of business interests? Is it about diplomatic isolation? Is it a blend of everything? And so if you can kind of go through those interest arguments, be very interested in your thoughts.
Well, Russia's got several interests, obviously, in Africa that are ever present, and some of those interests have changed slightly since the invasion of Ukraine. So I can just lay it out now and just briefly with each one explain how it's changed. I think that might be interesting. Number one, obviously, is hard currency, right? Russia has obviously been really looking for new markets since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, which isolated it from the West. And it's obviously been looking to global South leaders to fill the gap. And African countries, with many of them being under sanctions, many of them having authoritarian regimes that are largely isolated from the West and also being mineral rich and potentially oil rich, are fertile grounds for easy access contracts. Russia also has the inheritance of being the largest arms supplier on the continent. The Soviet Union had that role. It lost it in the 1990s. It regained it. So it was 38% of the total arms purchases from sub-Saharan Africa before the war in Ukraine. And Russia's got reliable clients that are dependent on Russian military technology, like Algeria, Sudan, Angola. So it can perpetuate and prolong those sorts of partnerships further. And obviously, in the context of the war in Ukraine, hard currency from Africa is even more important. So that's why things like smuggling gold out of Sudan and repurposing it to be used to finance the Wagner Group's activities in Ukraine, or increasing trade with major regional partners, like the more than 25% increase in trade that we've seen between Russia and Egypt, for example, over the course of the past year. Those things are important. Second, Russia wants to advertise itself as an alternative security provider, an alternative model of counterinsurgency to Western countries. And it really uses and sells what it promoted in Syria. So in Syria, Russia supported Bashar al-Assad and it managed to turn the tide of a war through air power and through the effective use of proxies and surrogates. And its narrative from that is appealing to many African countries because, in contrast to the United States, which was calling for regime change and which was calling for democracy promotion as the best antidote to extremism and insecurity, Russia worked with an autocrat, an existing set of state structures, didn't meddle in their internal affairs, and helped them turn the tide against what seemed to be a very, very long odds for Assad to stay in 2015. So the Russians are now trying to claim that they can advertise and make that success happen in other countries, like Central African Republic and Mali and Libya. And even though there's not much substance to that, it does seem to resonate amongst a sizable swathe of civil society, elites, and also officials. There was one very memorable quote, for example, from the Nigerian ambassador to Russia before the Sochi summit, where he says, "We want Russian jets, we want Russian MiGs, because we want to crush Boko Haram the way the Russians fought ISIS in Syria," forgetting the fact that the Russians barely even fought ISIS in Syria. They were just pulverizing rebels and people who opposed Assad. But that notion of Russia being an alternative security provider and that myth and that image is crucial because it allows for military technical agreements, arms sales, and basically gives Russia an illusion of great power status on the continent. And that's something that's important now to keep, as Russia's military appears to be floundering in Ukraine and the appeal of Russian weaponry appears to be dropping with the risk of sanctions and with the inefficacy of the current war. And finally, the other thing that Russia really wants in Africa is to build a normative coalition with countries that are opposed to American unipolarity, American unilateralism, and also simply just to run up vote tallies in the United Nations. Not necessarily votes of support, but they pay attention to the abstentions. And the very fact that about half of African countries on one of the major resolutions regarding Ukraine, either the invasion itself or the UN Human Rights Council resolution or the reparations resolution, have abstained, suggests that Russia is not isolated in the world. And that's important for them too, even more so now.
If we can touch on that, I was hoping to kind of put Ukraine to the side for the moment, but it's so integral to what we're talking about right now. How effective has Russia's efforts on the continent been? You talked about the abstentions and the votes against in the UN Security Council and the General Assembly, excuse me. And at a macro level, how effective has it been on the continent in terms of pursuing these interests? I imagine it's very uneven and related to kind of country to country, but what was your macro level assessment?
So basically, I think that Russia's involvement in Africa has been more effective than the Soviet Union in one respect, that they've been able to build a diverse array of partnerships in every single region instead of Soviet influence, which tended to be clustered in certain areas. I think immediately after decolonization, for example, they were doing quite well in the 1960s in West Africa. Then as the Brezhnev era rolled on, they were really consolidating in Ethiopia and the Horn, and also to some extent Southern Africa to put pressure on the apartheid regime. But there are many areas of the continent, like Central Africa, where the US had the alliance with Mobutu, CAR wasn't really moving on their side, other countries really, France had a lot of influence there, where they couldn't really get a foothold in. So Russia has been more effective than the Soviet Union in that respect, that it can establish footholds across the continent. Its strategy is a lot more nimble, agile, and opportunistic, and they can make quick decisions to step in when Western powers leave, or even the very specter of their arrival scares France into leaving, or Western powers into leaving, like we saw in Mali. So in stark contrast to what we see happening in the war in Ukraine, where Russia is always behind the 8 ball relative to the Ukrainians, they have a rigid command structure, they can't respond to events on the ground until it's far too late. In Africa, they've been surprisingly agile and surprisingly nimble, perhaps because decision-making on African issues is not so centralized. There are a lot of policy entrepreneurs. It's not just Putin calling the shots. So that's just one thing that's where Russians have done well. The Russians have also done well in ensconcing themselves, obviously, in terms of arms markets and UN votes, but much less successful, I think, in terms of actual investments or in really reinforcing their image as a reliable partner, because they always contrasted what they did in Syria to support Assad as a contrast to how America has abandoned its authoritarian allies when it proves inconvenient. So people like Mobutu or Suharto or Mubarak, the Americans discarded them ultimately when they didn't serve their purposes anymore. But the Russians also have serious problems in Africa with reliability. When you promise tens of millions of vaccine doses and you only give maybe 2 or 3% of them to a country that's supposed to be a close partner like Angola, and then you price gouge on them, charging $9 a dose when most other people are not, and charging like, well, 1/3 of that at cost, you really have problems with reliability. So Russia is having a mixed bag of successes and failures here. They're agile, but also that agility and that opportunism, paradoxically, is undermining their image as trying to be a more reliable, crisis-proof ally than the West.
I was wondering if you can go back for a moment and talk about that policy agility, because one of the things I think is quite interesting from a very large sort of American perspective is everything is run out of, incorrectly seen as everything's run out of obviously the Kremlin, from Putin on down. And that is the way that is incorrectly viewed over here. I'm curious if we could talk about that policy agility and how that has been affected on the ground and how that filters into sort of Russia's broader Africa strategy.
So the number one thing I often talk to when I'm addressing, American diplomats or British diplomats, and I try to explain how to combat Russian influence in Africa and how to counter and restrict the Wagner group in particular, is that if you try to chase Russia, you'll never be able to chase them. They'll always be able to run faster. They'll be more agile because they have a lot less at stake, and they're not really looking for depth. They're looking for breadth and also to some extent being a bit of a spoiler. But if you preempt them, then you can actually be and bust their narratives before they get the first mover advantage. Then you might have a chance. So Russia has got agility because simply I think it's got less at stake in terms of trying to build really deep partnerships and strategic alliances on the continent, contrast to what China is trying to do with the Belt and Road Initiative, with its law of long-term thinking, in contrast to what the Americans and the Europe and the French have tried to do over the course of time. So that's just what I mean by agility and why that can be capitalized as an advantage. It's ironically an advantage only because Russia has very limited set of tools it can offer these countries, and its ability to build deep partnerships is a lot more limited than what the USSR has. But to the point of decision making, there's also some interesting dimensions there. because there are many policy entrepreneurs who shape Russia's policy towards Africa. And these are some of them. So there initially, in the early 1990s, the cleavage was largely between the Russian Foreign Ministry, which was led by Andrei Kozyrev, the liberal westernizer who now is a dissident living in Miami, and the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Russian Ministry of Economic Development. And the cleavage there was basically that Kozyrev was wary about engaging with old Soviet allies where there was no seeming economic benefit in the short term, and also wary about engaging with autocracies and selling arms to active conflict zones and human rights violators, which would put Russia at odds with the West. Whereas the Defense Ministry and the Ministry of Economic Development wanted to keep those residual ties and those historic ties and preserve them. So those were the initial policy entrepreneurs, and that was the initial cleavage. In and around 1996, Yevgeny Primakov becomes foreign minister, and the Russia-West relationship, due to NATO expansion, due to the war in Kosovo, the war in Iraq, color revolutions, and just a general spiral of factors, unevenly but inevitably starts cascading downward. And the intellectuals who were supportive always of a more expansive Russian role in Africa and a more anti-Western role in Africa suddenly became policy entrepreneurs in their own right and advisors. So we need to look for people who are not in formal government positions, at least in the executive branch, but are influential experts who can played a role in shaping and influencing policy and are respected for their expertise instead of being punished for it like they are in other places. So people like Vladimir Shubin, a long-term friend of Nelson Mandela, who went to the Federation Council, he's one person. Alexei Vasilyev, who was a long-term advisor to Putin and Medvedev, who helped shape the Russian resurgence, is another person. Then there's also Russian state companies who have more freedom of action to explore and engage in contracts wherever possible, whether it be Western partners or non-Western partners, and also have a degree of agency in exporting Russian educational models and Russian soft power to a greater degree. And then you have security entrepreneurs, the most famous one, of course, being the head of the Wagner group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who basically suss out opportunities to carry out high risk, potentially high reward, deniable interventions on the Kremlin's behalf. And all those factions and all those individuals, combined with the fact that Dmitry Medvedev has a bit of an eclectic but somewhat deep interest in African affairs, and other figures in the Kremlin who have interest in that, all basically present their policies and their ideas towards Putin, and Putin straddles the disagreements that are remaining amongst those factions and makes a decision that amalgamates those decisions. So the process is a lot more bottom up to some degree within the elite establishment than it is on policy towards Ukraine or arguably policy towards Syria and the post-Soviet space. And that's something that's neglected. And therefore, we tend to miss signs by not paying attention to what influential intellectuals are saying, what influential research institutes are publishing, what state-owned companies are trying to do. If Putin doesn't go there personally, we tend to ignore it, and that's a mistake.
Yeah, it's definitely not all about Putin. I'm curious if you can talk about, is there any evidence with this bottom-up model that you're talking about, the political entrepreneurs, the business entrepreneurs, does that create friction from the bottom up in terms of conflicting interests, conflicting policies, just by virtue of having all these different actors happening? Have you seen any evidence of that?
I think that there's some evidence of contradictions that we're seeing. I think that the two countries where that I think has been most salient has been Libya and Sudan. For example, in the Libyan context, we saw a lot of disagreements, at least from my interviews and from my research, about the merits of Khalifa Haftar and whether he would actually be able to launch an effective offensive inside Tripoli. And I think that there were some elements, particularly within the GRU and the main intelligence directorate and Spetsnaz and some elements of the Russian Defense Ministry, who viewed Haftar as something of a useful project to be able to exert Russian influence over vital oil ports and also consolidate control in the long term over some of the sparsely populated but oil-rich areas of eastern and southern Libya. But on the flip side, there were a lot of reservations about Haftar, even within those very institutions. So within the Ministry of Defense, there was one camp that Shoigu aligned with that was anti-Turkish and that saw him as a bulwark against Turkish influence and also a reliable, if not reliable, kind of useful partner. And they backed his offensive operations. There was another wing of the Russian Ministry of Defense that basically viewed him with suspicion because he was a U.S. citizen, right? Because he was always seen as somehow having residual links to the CIA that he never cut off. There was a belief that his military prowess was not real. It was just being masked by the fact that the Emiratis were buying tribes, and he basically took over already surrendered populations and then claimed great victories. Then peel back a layer and you see the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs were engaging with UN diplomats like Stephanie Williams and expressing a lot of concern about how using an illegal private military company and backing a warlord who has no legal standing would affect the broader peace process and Russia's reputation. And then you have Yevgeny Prigozhin, who leveraged Haftar for a long time. Then eventually Wagner started getting more influence than Haftar on individual operations, and he pivoted towards backing Saif Gaddafi. So there was a moment in time where the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Wagner Group were mercenaries that were hired, were backing Haftar militarily. Lavrov was trying to reach out to Aguila Saleh and trying to establish relations through other deputies like Bogdanov towards Tripoli. And Prigozhin was trying to balance between Haftar and try to rehabilitate Gaddafi all at the same time. So there was a lot of chaos after the Turkish intervention. I think that was one of the reasons why the Russian response wasn't so effective and maybe why Haftar didn't necessarily succeed. And we're seeing the exact same thing play out again in Sudan, where we're seeing Yevgeny Prigozhin to a large extent cast his lot on the RSF chief Mohammed Hamdan Hemeti because of his access to gold mines that can fund Wagner Group operations in Ukraine. But we're also seeing the Russian foreign ministry and other elements of the government maintain close ties with Burhan, continue to engage with him on the Red Sea base because they don't trust Hemeti. They remember the fact that, for example, Hemeti was the person who scrapped the basing agreement on the Red Sea when it was on the cusp of being actualized, and they kind of can't look past that. So as we're seeing, the divisions on Sudan and on Libya, they're very palpable and they're very real. Ironically, they're involving some of the same actors, Prigozhin, Shoigu, Lavrov, that we're seeing in the Ukrainian context, but it's happening not so publicly, right? You're not seeing Prigozhin standing in front of Wagner corpses in African countries and shouting and swearing. But it's the same kind of cleavages. They don't really just compartmentalize them in one context.
No, it's very important, and I think a great point that you raised about the complexity and diversity of the Russian policymaking ecosystem and that it is not monolithic. I wanted to turn back to a comment that you made earlier when you're talking with American or speaking with American and British diplomats that you can't chase sort of a Russian policy across the continent. How much of the success that Russia has achieved under President Putin is a function of Western inattention to Africa or the prioritization, as you mentioned, about sort of regimes, human rights and other aspects over African country-based interest? So what's the balance between that and where's the tension do you see?
So that's a fascinating question. It's one that I'm unpacking now in my new book, really, about American policy towards Africa, as well as a bit in this one. And what I find that's really quite interesting is that definitely inattention has provided a foundation for Russia to expand its influence. I think that after the NATO intervention in Libya overthrew Muammar Gaddafi, it did not seem as if the Americans really had a long-term game plan. And the Trump administration in particular was very disengaged from the Libyan crisis and also was very willing to take narratives from Mohammed bin Zayed or Sisi at face value and not really impact policy in a more independent way. And that allowed Russia to really step in and establish a major foothold there. Similarly, the French lost interest in Central African Republic to some extent at the end of Operation Sangaris in 2016. They really wanted to pivot their military resources towards the Sahel and Barkhane. And the Americans never bothered to step into CAR or Congo or any of the other remaining countries. And that allowed Russia to really be able to step in and exert influence in that area. So that's an example of how Russia has capitalized on Western disengagement. Also, there was a feeling, I think, a perception until very recently, that if the West disengaged, Russia wouldn't necessarily step in because its interests in Africa were largely superficial. It was largely just going to be focused on, trying to accrue hard currency, not exerting political influence. People were very surprised that Russia actually tried to capture states in places like CAR or Mali, or even move in that direction. But that's because we've misread Russian strategy. The current Russian playbook did not begin in 2014. With the annexation of Crimea. It did not begin with the rise of Yevgeny Prigozhin a few years later. It began, as I just was alluding to earlier, in 1996 with the arrival of Yevgeny Primakov. So this is a strategy that Russia's been employing to capitalize on these weaknesses for 25 years in the making. And now it's just accelerating because the Russians need to pay more attention to Africa because they have fewer options in terms of alternative partners. And finally, to go to your other point, I would say, yes, I think the fact that at times it's not about human rights promotion or democracy promotion being good or bad. It's just that sometimes democracy promotion is talked about, like, for example, in Libya, moving towards the 2012 constitution, and then largely abandoned afterward. And then the French are even allowed to kind of come in and do shielding on Haftar's behalf, and the Americans don't even slap them on the wrist. The Emiratis, the Egyptians do lots of things, and the Americans don't slap their allies on the wrist to make sure that rein them in. So there's a lot of inconsistencies, I think, in the promotion of democracy, talking about it in the short term, but not following through in the long term, and also the West's tendency to coddle autocrats in the region as a gateway to combating instability, like France's relationships with Idris Deby in Chad or Keita in Mali, and those contradictions between democracy promotion in some contexts and not following through, backing autocrats in other contexts, and then attacking Russia and China for backing autocrats in other places, that provides a mistrust of the West and creates double standards that Russia loves to exploit, and that also has helped Russia.
I want to turn a little bit to the aspect of Russian sort of tactics and tools on the continent. You talked about a lot of the traditional aspects of sort of arms transfers, country-to-country relations, business transactions that were necessarily followed through upon. How much of it on the continent today is about a function of elite capture versus influencing the actual local populations? Some of the comments that we've seen, obviously, with this renewed attention on Russia and Africa, is very much about the Wagner forces, but also that information operations campaign. Are we looking at the right things in terms of Russian tactics and behavior, or are we fixating too much on what Wagner is doing on the ground versus that elite capture?
So I think that we should be focusing on all these things in integrated fashion, because all of Russia's hybrid tactics have a relatively common intermesh set of goals. So what Russia tends to do when it intervenes in a particular country is a common playbook. Number one, it starts launching information warfare campaigns to kind of prime the public with anti-Western narratives, and particularly, I think they've been effective in promoting anti-French narratives. And let's take the case of Mali, for example, and I'll use each of these steps and explain how we got there. So in Mali, they started really promoting the narrative, which is partially correct, that the NATO military intervention in Libya and the chaos that followed created small arms proliferation, and the West did nothing about it. Then they extend that narrative into the sphere of disinformation, where they basically argue that France's and America's only goal in the Sahel is to capture and plunder uranium reserves and gold reserves, and counterterrorism, counterinsurgency is all a shield and a smokescreen for that, even though that may actually be Russia's real intent when it comes to their involvement in the continent. And then they start capitalizing on the inefficacy of the Operation Barkhane, at least in terms of stemming the rise of extremism after 2016, comparing that with a false comparison to their involvement in Syria. And then they start kind of inventing and coming up with different atrocities that the West supposedly perpetrated in that area while neglecting their own. So the Ghazi massacre, for example, versus the real Mura massacre, one a staged one, one a real one. So that's kind of what they do. And they use their Sputnik French and their ability to reach millennials on social media and hire local surrogates who are sympathetic to their messages to promote this. Under the guise and under the umbrella of all of this, Russia promotes itself as an opponent of neocolonialism. Then they see a friendly autocrat eventually take power into the form of Assimi Goïta. And they view backing Assimi Goïta as a way of correcting all the ills I just spoke about French involvement, and they lionize Goïta into basically being a modern-day Nkrumah, a modern-day, sort of decolonization hero. And they kind of leverage and take advantage of the closed media space to really promote those narratives further. Then Goïta invites private military contractors in. Those private military contractors establish links to the security establishment and fight seamlessly together, including sharing bases and facilities. They start trying to guard and take control over crucial mining assets, especially the gold mining assets in Mali. And then they carry out military activities. In the process, the West gets spooked, and Operation Barkhane and Takuba and everybody withdraws from Mali. And all of a sudden, Russia is the primary security partner and is attempting to capture the state. The only reason why they haven't been able to capture the state yet is because they weren't able to secure the largest gold mine and establish a financing source, and their military operations have been spectacular failures. But that's the playbook that they try to use, and that's how they're trying to work on it. So when we're looking at Russian information warfare, and we're looking at Wagner Group's ground activities, and we're looking at these alignments with autocrats and the shielding of autocrats, we should always be paying attention and being vigilant to what the end game is. And the end game is very often establishing a malleable client, state capture, and capitalizing on these countries' isolation for the long term. It's as Blinken said before the war in Ukraine, when the Russians come into your house, they never want to leave. And it's the same thing in African countries as well.
It seems like the Russians get into the walls. So looking in that sort of step by step, which is very fascinating, from the information operations all the way through to the end state, where do you see the opportunities for the United States, France specifically, to break into that cycle and disrupt it? Because it seems, as you rightly said, if we're chasing Wagner all over the place, we're chasing Russian all over the place, we're not going to be successful. We need to anticipate and get ahead of it. Where do you see, at sort of a macro level, obviously country by country is very different, but how do you see getting into that cycle and disrupting it?
Well, the first thing I think we need to do, and one of the things I've often recommended, is that if you want to beat the Wagner group, you've got to destroy and crush the myth of Wagner. The fact that it's not a force for neocolonialism or this kind of omnipotent shadow army that's kind of going to be able to do much better job than what the French or the Americans are able to do. It's a largely loosely heterogeneous gang of mixed ex-mercenaries and special forces, and as well as ordinary criminals who have no regard for the lives of civilians or have no real regard for any kind of human rights. It's appealing in some contexts where their willingness to be brutal in their tactics might be seen as a sign of strength, but actually it's a reflection of their inability to target. And that should be kind of pointed out in the first go. Also, Russia's efforts to basically either sell cost-ineffective, potentially kleptocratic enabling nuclear energy projects, like we've seen Rosatom try to do in places like South Africa, or seize control over diamond and gold mining assets across the continent, is proof of the fact that they are coming to Africa to extract. They're not coming to Africa for the prosperity of the local populations at all. And they're looking to back autocrats, and autocracy promotion is more important than actual counterterrorism or actual stabilization. And that's exactly what was the most important thing for them to do in Syria. So to win the war against Russian influence in Africa, you have to kind of really promote those narratives and start winning the information war on the continent and really paying more attention to it. So when RT and Sputnik are expanding their number of bureaus in African countries, RT is just opening one in South Africa, and also intelligence operatives who have been expelled from Europe are starting to move to African countries to provide political technologists cover and enable these kind of operations. We shouldn't be cutting resources to places like Voice of America or the BBC or our media outlets or our soft power outlets precisely at the same time, because that doesn't necessarily do very well. So, and also we should be thinking about having a first mover advantage in the information sphere. One of the big reasons why Russia's narrative about the Black Sea grain export deal, for example, has been so compelling that they blame sanctions and they absolve themselves from blockading ports, is that Russian ambassadors plant their stories in major media outlets, and the West or Ukraine doesn't respond or responds months later, by which time opinions have been formed and officials start regurgitating that data, and it's very hard to change the narrative once Russia's got the first mover advantage. So winning the information war is extremely, or trying to combat Russia in the information war, not necessarily fighting fire with fire, like the French tried to do with rival troll farms that were spreading disinformation against Russian troll farms that were spreading disinformation in the CAR, and everybody cancels each other out. But fighting fire with truth, I think, can actually be a strategy that can really work if you're proactive enough and you're involved enough and you're engaged enough. Number two is also recognize the fact that most African countries really want to have multi-vector and multifaceted foreign policies. So you have to be tolerant to the fact that most countries will view their foreign policy situationally. They'll want to maintain a linkage to Russia, a linkage to China, a linkage to Europe, and linkage to America, and also smaller powers like Turkey, Gulf countries, etc. And they won't want to be forced to make choices because they want to get an investment for everybody, economic capital for everybody, education for everybody, as well as even military technology for as many sources as possible. And forcing countries into this binary choice that either you have to be with us and shun everyone else. The zero-sum, great power competition-centric framework of engaging with Africa is very, very deleterious and very counterproductive, and it can easily be framed as by the Russians or by somebody else as some kind of neo-colonial power exertion. So being more tolerant and pragmatic about different relationships, and also not just abandoning countries as soon as Russia comes in, Because in Central African Republic, for example, when I speak to people around Touadera and other people, there's a lot of buyer's remorse about what Wagner has done and the degree to which it's captured the state. But the problem is America is completely disinterested and the French fled. Touadera's meeting with Macron and Gabon was a sign that, even in a country where it looks as if the Russians are captured the state, there's still a desire to engage in a multi-vector fashion. So that's important. Respecting the freedom of choice, respecting the freedom of agency of African countries, and really acknowledging that they see themselves as part of a multipolar order and engaging with them more pragmatically with that. And finally, I think is smart sanctions. I think that what we see, for example, in a country like Zimbabwe, where Ambassador Charles Ray from Zimbabwe, he knows this firsthand, and we've talked about this, that, when you're sanctioning dead people, when you're sanctioning defectors who have risked their lives to go against the Mugabe regime, and you don't update your lists, the feeling is that the sanctions are not an instrument of policy, they are a policy in themselves. And that makes regimes who are targeted or under pressure to democratize or under pressure for human rights even less willing to reform or less willing to pursue a more constructive course. So being more flexible, being more open-minded, and also just paying more attention to who and what you're sanctioning in these countries, I think is also important. So to win the information war, you need to break the Russian media advantage, break the Russian neocolonial narrative, and also break Russia's ability to capitalize on sanctions and isolation as vigorously as they have.
That's very interesting. You raised that multi-vector aspect of African country interests with the United States, France, China. I do want to open it up to questions from the audience. I actually have received one over text message. Looking specifically about China, how does Russia see China in Africa? Is it a partner? Is it a competitor? Is it a case-by-case basis? Or is it not a function or factor in this calculus?
Yeah, so just like the very first question we talked about, which was like, is it a bellicose pretender or a resurgent great power? I tend to take the middle ground on the China issue. And I kind of view, you said partner competitor, I come up with the phrase competitive partner. And this is what I mean by that. I mean that they're partners at a superficial level. In the United Nations, Russia and China generally do vote for each other. They generally are inclined to be skeptical of the same UN peacekeeping missions like those in Sudan. The general avoidant about imposing unilateral sanctions or multilateral sanctions if the crime is just human rights abuses and not something that's a transnational threat, like we saw when they blocked together the sanctions on Mugabe in Zimbabwe. But there's also, and also Russian and Chinese media outlets, particularly I would say Xinhua and RT and Sputnik, and also just their broader machineries tend to reinforce similar narratives about the West. But beyond that, there's really not much in terms of actual cooperation. For example, there's only one forum where Russia and China actually engage regularly on Africa-related issues. It's an economic forum that was just established 2 or 3 years ago. We never really see, for example, Lavrov and Wang Yi, or basically, or in the course Putin or Xi, really having detailed descriptions about African issues on the agenda. One of the rare cases where I spotlighted in my book, because it was so rare, was the crisis in Libya in 2011, where we started seeing Hu Jintao and Medvedev and their lower level officials engaging and supporting common ideas. Also, beyond that, we're actually seeing some competitive activities and some contradictory activities in Russian and Chinese policy. So the Chinese media, before the war in Ukraine, before this 2022 invasion of Ukraine, the Wagner Group and its inefficacy was one of the few areas where Chinese media had almost free reign to criticize Russia. So you see People's Liberation Army Daily or People's Daily articles actually talking about how Wagner went into Mozambique and they didn't know what they were doing and they got lost in a tropical forest and lots of their people died. And that was actually being discussed and openly put forward. And that was reflective of a broader concern about how private security companies that Russia's hiring could threaten the stability of the Belt and Road Initiative. It could threaten the stability of some of what China is trying to offer. Moreover, we've also seen Russia try to present itself as a hedge partner to countries that are especially dependent on Chinese influence. We saw that in Zimbabwe, for example, where they invested in Darwindale and they invested in other mining schemes that were directly in competition to how China was maneuvering and capitalizing on Mugabe's indigenization laws. So Russia and China actually compete economically, and they don't necessarily cooperate on joint projects. So that's why there's a competitive, contradictory dimension, but there's also this kind of ideational and normative partnership that we see exhibit itself in the United Nations. And it's that mixture that I think makes the competitive partnership title the best way to view Russia-China relations in Africa.
Do you see that changing at all in light of Russia's post-expanded invasion of Ukraine political isolation? Is this an area where you may see increased cooperation, or do you not anticipate that you see this competitive partnership continuing?
I don't really see much of a sphere for increased cooperation because one, Russia's policy in Africa has not changed substantially in ways that would make it more beneficial for China. Russia's keeping its mercenaries in Libya, keeping its mercenaries in Car, keeping its mercenaries in Mali, and if anything, Wagner's trying to expand, and it's trying to expand in ways that may not necessarily be uh, advantageous to China. It's interesting that Chinese peacekeepers and Chinese missions cooperate more with countries like Britain and the West on peacekeeping in the Sahel than they do with Wagner. You never really see any joint Wagner PLA operations happening anywhere, and I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. So the fact that Wagner is trying to expand and outsource itself and get access to more mineral resources may actually make the chasm even deeper. And also, we're seeing Russia basically still try to present itself, even in articles like by academics like Dmitry Suslov and Alexei Maslov, as an unambiguous hedge partner to the Chinese. So I don't really see that changing. Another thing to keep in mind is that Chinese scholars and Chinese academics have often had a much clearer-eyed view of Russian influence in Africa than we have in the West. For example, they're much more willing to acknowledge Russia's limitations, right? They acknowledge the fact that, racism that's apparent in Russian society, ironically neglecting some of the same problems in Chinese society, but pointing out things like that, pointing out also the limited economic potential there, and also really highlighting, even in some of their state media, that the Russian model of power projection in Africa is not something we would ever want to replicate. So the Chinese don't really necessarily view Russian policy in Africa with a whole lot of respect, and are also not inclined to really sensationalize it or overblow Russian influence, nor do they really see it as useful, based on what I've just said about the Wagner Group. Mm-hmm. So they don't really see Russian influence as so threatening that they need to work with them to tone it down, or so useful that they want to work with them to kind of advance their interests. And that's why I don't think there's going to be much of a change.
Looking at the impact of Russia's expanded invasion of Ukraine, how do you see this conflict affecting its ability to pursue its interests and policies on the continent of Africa? I think in your book, you talk specifically about sort of the severely constrained resources that are going to result, but what other areas are you focused on and paying attention to as a result of that?
First, I think is the longer term impact of sanctions, and really, how far do they spill over? That's the most important thing we should be looking at. So far, it seems as if outside the sphere of arms sales, or even with Algeria, arms sales were in decline from 2010, and now they're in decline much more drastically and rapidly across the world. It does seem as if sanctions are having a limiting effect. Elsewhere, it hasn't really. Rosatom, for example, the nuclear energy giant, in spite of all of Zelensky's pleas and Ukraine's urges that Russia's weaponizing a nuclear power plant in Zaporizhia, Rosatom is having a connection to that. Maybe we should sanction Rosatom. The West hasn't moved in that direction. So as long as Rosatom is unsanctioned, it can continue to operate in Aldaba and Egypt and try to explore wherever it can new theaters. Also, we're seeing Russian sales of most manufacturing exports, which are limited trade, either stay low or grow in many places. So sanctions so far have not really limited Russia's potential to expand its influence in Africa outside of the defense sector. That's an important thing to keep in mind. So I think that's sanctions are a constraint in the defense sector, not so much outside. But if sanctions do tighten eventually over time, like the EU, like the Russians, for example, go too far with their weaponization of Zaporizhia and like steal the electricity and reroute it to their occupied territories, or an incident happens there, God forbid, something like that happens, then I think the avenues for engaging with Russia will be a lot more constrained. So that's something that we should watch for, first of all. Second of all, I think we should also be watching for, how African countries exactly position themselves as the African Union, and also individual states like Zambia, the Republic of Congo, now Uganda, South Africa, Egypt. They've all formed this kind of African peace leaders mission that's under the supervision of Jean-Yves Olivier, a veteran French diplomat who helped contribute to negotiations that helped end the apartheid in South Africa. Do the rising profile of African countries on issues relating to from food security to conflict resolution in Ukraine, this desire to exert independent influence and independent, or at least an independent presence on a major security issue, lead to more African countries skirting a tighter balance, like balancing with engagement with Russia, but also opening up new embassies in Ukraine. So I think that there's some risk factors downward. I think as Africa gets more involved in diplomacy, they might want to go from more of a faux neutrality that's pro-Russian neutrality into more of a real non-alignment, and also the risk of sanctions spilling over to new sectors. But until then, Russia's MO is largely going to continue the same, and their military presence, as I've said earlier, are more likely to increase in Africa, in spite of their manpower problems in Ukraine from time to time, than decrease, because it's a source of profit, and it's a source of proof that Russia has not expended its standing as a great power.
When you look specifically at the arms sales to African countries, do you envision that the rearmament program that Russia will almost certainly have to undertake as a result of the significant conventional losses it's incurred in Ukraine, do you see that impacting its ability to sustain or maintain and meet those sales that it has already committed to, or limit its ability to make future sales?
I think, it's going to be a mixture of both, because sales that they're committed to are extremely complicated. Because before the war in Ukraine, of course, we had CATSA, right? We had the Countering American Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which always imposed the risk of secondary sanctions or cutoffs of U.S. military technology for countries that were purchasing Russian weapons. And that didn't deter everything. I mean, the MiG jets still arrived in Nigeria. Algeria continued to purchase weaponry even up to the S-400, and there's been a hedge or a debate about whether that could happen. Angola was still purchasing Russian weaponry. But other countries like Egypt, for example, were always on the fence and always concerned about whether or not to take that next step to purchase the Su-35s. And then when the war in Ukraine happened and the Americans started putting more pressure on Sisi, those Su-35s ended up going to Iran. They didn't end up going to Egypt. So there's always been a doubt or a concern about the purchases of Russian weaponry from African countries. And that's really quite significant even before the war. And I think that will probably persist onward into this current conflict. So the Russians will have difficulty marketing and fulfilling their extant contracts anyways because of sanctions risk. And then add the fact that, they're really scouring for weapons in Africa. I mean, they're looking for ammunition dumps wherever they can find them and trying to get them out. They're really trying to get those 40,000 Grad rockets from Egypt coming their way. They're grifting for the bottom of the barrel weaponry where they are. And the rearmament is also going to probably impede new sales. So I suspect that Russian arms presence in Africa will mirror what we're seeing in the early 1990s, where they just drop down the rungs for a while, at least until countries either return to relying on Russian technology or more countries start turning towards Chinese or Western technology, and Russia never reclaims that front position. That's an open question.
Looking specifically about South Africa, we recently saw the announcement that they are going to give diplomatic immunity to anybody coming to the BRICS conference, but they left the door open for executing potential international criminal court warrants. Where do you see South Africa's role in the conflict specifically relates to Ukraine and balancing its relationships and interests with Russia?
So South Africa's policy towards Russia is extremely complicated, and it comes from an official desire to be neutral in this conflict or not aligned, and that means they don't criticize, they don't blame Russian aggression. That's how they interpret it. So they pass a humanitarian aid resolution in Ukraine that gets shot down, but it doesn't blame Russia. They present themselves as a possible mediator and the leader now of this African peace mission. But and they also present themselves as trying to have a situational partnership with Russia, just like the way they would engage with China, the West. They don't want to have to choose or pick sides. They're the classic example of that kind of multivectoralism that I was talking about earlier. But in practice, South Africa is leaning more towards the Russians than they are towards the Ukrainians, just based on the frequency of dialogue between Putin and Ramaphosa. The allegation that now South Africa turned a blind eye to ammunition shipments coming out of Simonstown port, which the Americans have challenged them on. The government is now investigating, even though they deny that's happened. They're investigating it still nonetheless. And now they're skirting a delicate stance in the ICC question, where they're granting immunity, but also making it clear that immunity does not necessarily mean that their ICC commitments are null and void. They may have the two of them together. So they're not making a determination on that. But in general, South Africa is nominally positioning itself as a neutral stakeholder, but its leanings are a lot closer to Russia than Ukraine. But that's just the ANC elite's leanings, and also some activist groups like Malima's Youth League, who just was saying that South Africa should fight for the Russian cause and kind of take up arms for it. It's an anti-imperial cause. The Democratic Alliance Party, the biggest one of the opposition parties, is very much against it and wants Putin to be indicted as a war criminal. And public opinion in South Africa has also soured towards Russia, particularly in the aftermath of Jacob Zuma's corruption with the Rosatom plant and the Gupta family's arrest and all the chaos that surrounded that. And also the fact that, South African regulatory bodies never even approved Sputnik 5. And during the health crisis, the Russians were not really seen to be there either. So there's a lot of, there's not much public support for a strong partnership with Russia, aside from an older generation who's very nostalgic for the Soviet Union's being anti-apartheid. But there's an ANC elite level bias towards Russia that makes their non-alignment more of a pro-Russian neutrality. That's how I would classify it.
Looking forward to the potential sort of resolution of the conflict in Ukraine, do you see South Africa leaning forward to try to be, the leader or an interlocutor or discussant there? And then a second question there is there's been a lot of talk, certainly in Washington and European capitals, about the inverted commas global South and the West's understanding of certainly Africa's approach to Ukraine. So in the first question, where do you see South Africa playing that role? And then the second question being, is the West getting the approach to African involvement or support for Ukraine right? Or is it just missing and asking the wrong question full stop, and it's not a function of support?
South Africa's position on Ukraine is going to be, largely aimed at elevating its position in international affairs as the middle power. And we saw that, for example, not just for the first time in the Ukrainian context, we saw that in Libya, where they were the champion of an African-led solution to the Libyan crisis. We saw even, Dmitry Medvedev broker a meeting between Zuma and officials from NATO to promote Thabo Mbeki's alternative peace plan, which would have led to peace in Libya without the removal of Gaddafi. So that's South Africa, again, reprising that same kind of role in the Ukrainian context and a new context, and trying to show itself as a leading diplomatic entrepreneur on the continent. So that's not necessarily new for them. South Africa obviously has diplomatically participated in other regional conflicts, like the Tigrayan War, for example. So this is part of South Africa's desire to burnish its image as a middle power outside of African issues and be Africa's voice in international affairs, with the long-term aim, most likely, of taking that elusive one-day African UN Security Council seat, and also being Africa's representative in BRICS. But the Russians have promised that UNSC seat to Egypt and Nigeria at the same time, if it ever were to happen. So that's not clear. And BRICS is expanding. So this is a way to kind of counteract some of those developments and assert themselves and move them forward. With respect to Africa's position on the conflict, I think that there's a view that in Africa that abstention equals neutrality equals being pro-peace, and that's fundamentally different on the Western view, which accepting abstaining or being neutral means legitimizing territorial occupation and legitimizing the annexation of territory and violations of international law. And those two views are very hard to separate, but they are rather very hard to converge. And they'll remain separate, and it's just going to be an issue that is going to be a source of disagreements between African countries and the West for the foreseeable future. It was interesting to see what the African leaders were proposing in this current peace mission. They wanted, for example, an immediate ceasefire and a second referendum in Donbass, and nothing about the status of Crimea. And that was what they told Junafrique, and the Russians just said Junafrique is not credible, and they laughed that off because they thought it was too moderate for them. But that just shows the starting point. The Americans are saying that we don't want a peace formula that's with third-party mediation that doesn't abide by Zelensky's peace formula, which said everybody in Russia should leave Ukraine, whereas the African countries were already willing to effectively take steps to freeze the conflict and grant Russian territory in order to proceed with mediation. And that disagreement is not going to heal itself as long as the frontline situation remain how it is.
If I'm sort of one last question before I'll turn it over to Glenn, Representative Nye, to close us out. When you look at the discourse on Russia in Africa, what is the biggest question that should be asked but is not being asked right now? Or if you were to advise policymakers, what is the thing that they should be focusing on that you don't see them focusing on right now?
Well, that's a really great question. I think that we should really be paying attention to the sources and the of engagement inside Africa. We should really be focusing on the fact that yes, there are the arms sales, yes, there are the material factors, but it's Russia's use of ideational bonds and also these kind of weaponization of historical narratives that really power and drive Russia's ability to defy the odds and defy its relatively limited military capabilities and punch seemingly above its weight. So I think we should really be looking again. I think the thing we should be paying most attention to is patterns in Russian messaging and how that messaging is being done at the elite and the popular level. Is there a convergence in it, or are they trying to find a pliable elite against a population that is more skeptical? Just looking at messaging and is really a narrative promotion is really important, because to weaken Russian influence in Africa, the fastest way to do it and the fastest shortcut to doing it is winning the narrative war, or at least countering their narratives.
Well, this has been an absolutely fantastic discussion. I can't thank you enough for first writing this book, which is incredibly insightful and incredibly deep on a subject that is getting belated but certainly renewed attention as a function of what's happening on the continent and Russians' behavior there. So thank you very much for the book, and thank you for joining us for this great discussion. I will leave it to Representative Nye for the closing thoughts.
I just want to echo Joshua's thanks, Dr. Ramani, for spending the time with us, for putting the intellectual capital into the book, and for sharing your really important insights with us on the nature of Russian operations in Africa, and what that teaches us about how great powers work, and how Russia in particular pulls the levers of policymaking and execution. We have heard quite a bit from several of our allies about Russia's activities in Africa and how they've impacted them. And it's definitely an area we want to keep an eye on. It's a place where we can take a lot of lessons learned for the broader great powers competition study. So thank you very much for all your inputs, for a very interesting conversation today. Thanks to Joshua for setting this up and for managing a really quite interesting discussion. And thanks to our participants for joining us, and to those who will enjoy the watching of the video when we post this. We appreciate your participation and look forward to seeing you again on another conversation soon. Thanks, everybody.